Tonight, if you did not get the papers for tonight, because there is a little bit of a questionnaire for tonight's class. If you haven't got it, it's on the back table in the foyer. With that being said, we are going to pick back up in our second lesson for this evening. As we mentioned at the close of last class, as we were continuing to talk through the ideas of worship and the authority therein, or establishing the authority that goes into us beginning our discussion on worship, the sheet for tonight is going to cover the first act of worship that we will be going over, which is preaching. And if we get through all of that this evening, then next week, most likely, we will be beginning to talk about giving. We're not going to be going in any pre-established order. And since there was a couple of questions about giving last week, I figured we would bump that up a little bit from what I originally planned. Now, with that being said, as kind of a refresher of what we talked about last week, we talked about sort of some expectations for this class, the fact that we are going through foundational ideas that to some of you might feel a little repetitive, or if you want to use the word basic, or elementary, that the purpose of this class is to pick up from something we started about a year ago. For those that were in that first iteration of the class, this is continuing to be that idea for those that are younger in the faith to learn some of these concepts you may not have had opportunities to learn, or that you may have missed as you were growing up in the church. Now, with that being said, we began our discussion of talking about biblical authority with the intention to going into talking about the 5 acts of worship. Now, last week we began and then also ended in Genesis chapter 4, or actually we ended in Leviticus chapter 10, but we started in Genesis chapter 4 looking at the story of Cain and Abel. And where authority is concerned when it comes to worship, what is the big principle that we took away from Genesis chapter 4 concerning certain authority principles of worship? There's right ways and wrong ways, or the other way that we said it is that there is a standard. God establishes that if someone is going to worship Him, that some worship will be deemed acceptable and some will not. And we get this from this story of Cain and Abel because Cain's sacrifice is accepted and Abel's sacrifice is accepted and Cain's is rejected. And the reason for that rejection, and as we sort of look at a couple of other passages, that there was something missing. There was not the heart behind it, that there is a difference between the two sacrifices. But purely, in Genesis 4, God accepted Abel's, and for Cain's, He did not. So that means for us, as we talked about last week, that just saying, well, we did worship to God. We said we believed in God. We worshiped Him. Therefore, God will accept it. We believe in Jesus. And as long as we're saying that Jesus is the Son of God, that's fine. That will be acceptable to God. And one of the points that we made last week is if it is true of God's character and what is acceptable to Him in the Old Testament, for the most part, does that change? Do those principles change when we fast forward to the new law? No, they remain consistent. They remain static. And so, if this is true of God having a standard when it comes to the Old Testament at the very beginning of the world, then that would be true in 2025. That would be true when the new law is given 2,000 plus years ago. So, now, we move forward to Leviticus chapter 10, which we sort of squeezed in at the very end of class last week. And we are looking at the story of Nadab and Abihu. If someone could, for me, just very quickly in your own words, summarize what is the story we read in Leviticus chapter 10 and verses 1 and 2. All right, Clay said that they offered strange fire that was not sanctioned by the Lord, and that is exactly correct. God dictates a way for the fire to be prepared. If you look at Leviticus chapter 10 and verse 1, it is very clear that there was a way that the fire was to be prepared. And Nadab and Abihu knew that, and they chose to do it a different way. So it is called strange fire that they offered. And what happens to them for offering that strange fire? They were consumed by fire from heaven. They were killed by God. And that leads us to our second principle of worship, and that is that God does not accept improvisation, deviation, ad-libbing, whatever synonym you want to use there. When God says, here are the instructions, and goes through very detailed instructions, and Ian Jones and I were sort of talking about this last week after class, and we made the point that pretty much everything in their tabernacle was given highly specific instructions on how it was to be prepared, from what material you use to make the poles that carry the tent, all the way to the garments of the Levitical priests, to the high priest's garment, how you prepare the incense or the fire that is burned inside the tabernacle. All of it is given highly specific instructions by God. And what this chapter shows to us, or this story that we just read, is that if those instructions are willfully ignored, and this was a point that we didn't bring up last week, but it was sort of mentioned in talking about Cain and Abel, is that Cain and Abel knew that they were supposed to do something. There were instructions given. How do we know that? Because they did it. We don't know exactly what God said. We don't know the word for word instructions, but they were given something. Because, again, normal human behavior does not cover just waking up and going, I'm going to go sacrifice a lamb to Jehovah God. Something had to be told to them. It's the only thing that makes any sort of plausible sense. And we talked about what is that a just law and a just lawgiver is someone that makes sure that the law is clear enough so that it can be followed. That a tyrant makes a law and holds people to a law and then doesn't tell them what the law is. That is a textbook example of tyranny. And if we're to say that God is just, God is good, God is fair, God is loving, so on and so forth, it necessitates that there was information given on how worship ought to be done, on how Cain and Abel were supposed to do it. And so we apply that to Nadab and Abihu. Did they know? Well, yes, God, through Moses, told the entire people, here's what you're supposed to do, and then gave specific instructions to the Levites, which would include Aaron's two children. Here's how you make the fire. Here's how you make the incense. So can they claim that, well, we were ignorant and God was punishing us in our ignorance? Can they make that claim, do you think? No, the law was known. They were told, they were given the instructions. And therefore, what we must conclude is they willfully ignored those instructions to do it their own way. And the reason I spent that time to make that specific point is when it comes to worship, we are given instructions. We'll get into some more of the instructions in a moment. But we're told by God, here's how you ought to do it. You know, those 5 acts of worship that we're going to talk about in the next couple of classes, those are the instructions. That's the guideline. And it is not something that we can be ignorant of. And if we are choosing to go against that or to ignore those things, we are choosing to ignore how God wants it done, thus falling into this principle of Leviticus chapter 10. That's why it's not only important that we know what God wants us to do, and I think that goes without saying almost, but also that this punishment that Nadab and Abihu is getting is not just because they didn't do what God said, it's because they knew and they didn't do it anyway. They ignored it. They were given the instructions and they decided, for whatever reason, maybe it was a good reason, and I say good in air quotes, maybe it was an understandable excuse, maybe it could have been laziness, maybe they couldn't find the right ingredients. Whatever it could be, we can just be here all night thinking up speculative stories of what excuses they could have came up with. But the fact of the matter is here's how God said to do it, and they didn't do it, and they chose not to do it God's way. It wasn't just well, I don't know what I'm doing, so I just will just kind of, improv something. No, the instructions of how to do it properly were there, and they chose not to do it. Do you guys see that there's a stark difference between those two and why that caveat is important? Because when we choose to ignore God's way, that is the ad-libbing, that is the improvisation that God does not have any tolerance for. And certainly did not for Nadab and Abihu. Mitch, you had your hand up earlier, I think. Yeah, we set God apart by how we worship Him. Holy, it literally means in English to set apart from the original Greek word. If we are setting God apart, we should be treating Him differently than we say, than you would at a business or going through something in your everyday life where it might be acceptable to just throw some duct tape on it and get it done. That's a good old redneck repair job right there, and it'll get it done. But we treat God differently. We don't just try and pass the bare minimum and say, God's standard is a little too hard. That's going to take a lot more work. Well, I'm going to still get it done, but I'm going to do it my own way. I think there's a better way to do it or a different way to do it than what is written, than what is instructed. The examples, the commands that we talked about last week of, with biblical authority, that there's direct command, an example, and necessary inference. If we see something that falls under those lines in the words of God and we ignore it, we're doing exactly what Nadab and Abihu did. This is why, too, the other thing, and I wouldn't call this one of our major principles, but this also sets the stakes for us. How do you think that this passage sets the stakes for us when it comes for worship, where it kind of gives us an idea of, how serious this is? What here might, in this passage, might set some stakes?
I think the fact that they were consumed by fire. You offered strange fire, here you go.
Right. They are killed. They are consumed by fire. We might think of this today. Someone's talking about worship. You hear myself or Randy get up there and says, okay, we got to partake of the Lord's Supper every single week and do it this way and do it that way. We got to make sure that our mind's prepared. And your eyes might just glaze over like, why is it so important that we follow these rituals so closely? It's not life or death. Why do we take these things so seriously? Why do, if we propose a change that might change one of those acts of worship a little bit, add something in, take something away. Let's say, we've got a lot of people with grape juice allergy. And we're gonna not do grape juice anymore, or let me rephrase that. We're not gonna do the fruit of the vine anymore. We're just gonna get rid of that and do bread only. We're still doing the Lord's Supper. Now, why would someone then get so upset about that change? And someone is going to sit and say to themselves, or might think to themselves, man, why is Robert taking that so seriously? Why is he so upset? Someone's just saying we've got a lot of people allergic to this. Maybe we should, do something else. Because the stakes are set for us here with Nadab and Abihu. As Christina just said, they were killed. Now, someone today might say, well, Robert, God isn't throwing fire down from heaven to kill you if you don't partake of the Lord's Supper the right way, or if you don't preach the right way. I kind of almost look at that as the same thing that the serpent says to Eve, and I mean that in just sort of the principle that's being established. Surely you won't die. Right? You're not going to die if you don't worship the way God says to. You're not going to have what happens to Nadab and Abihu if you improv, if you sort of ad-lib, if you add to or take away from worship. See how those things kind of sound similarly? But yet the reality is what? Do we still risk death today? Of course. But it's not a physical death that we're most concerned about. It's a spiritual one. Dana, you had your hand up, and I think I saw a hand over there.
What happens in our world today, there's a lot of people out there who are worshiping, or what they think is worshiping God, because I like it like this. This is good. I really love the band. They're so good. And there is no punishment immediately. The people that saw this happen with Nadab and Abihu, they went, oh man. And there is none of that today. There's no, you better do it or X, Y, Z is going to happen. Nothing happens. And the word out there is, God will understand.
Yeah.
And there is no punishment. So why would we think that anybody would be concerned that we do it correctly?
Yeah. And they're ignoring all of the times that God showed and set the principle that there will be punishment. It just is not immediate like we see here. There will be a judgment for how we worship God. He's still going to care. Just because we don't see the evidence immediately doesn't mean that he still doesn't care. We know that because sometimes God has to set a very hard rule. You can almost look at Acts chapter 5. There's two individuals named Ananias and Sapphira. They are selling off a bit of their land to give back to the church, and they lie about how much of the proceeds. They say they gave all of it, and they held back for themselves. And not only do they lie to Peter, they lie in front of Peter, essentially lying to the Holy Spirit. They lie to God, and they are immediately killed. Does every person who lies in the church, lies to an apostle or lies to the Holy Spirit, immediately die from that point onwards? No, we'd read about it. I think even history would go, spontaneous deaths happen all the time in the first century. Someone lied to an apostle, they died. That didn't happen. But it's to set the principle. God is setting the stakes for us that you may not die immediately, just like Adam and Eve did not die immediately, but they suffered a spiritual death. Richard, you had your hand up.
First Samuel 15, verse 22, and the Lord has set the light of burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord. Behold, to obey is better than the sacrifice, and to eat than the fat of the ram. So the obedience
Mm-hmm.
is the most important. They were Cain and Abel. Abel gave the first fruits. Apparently Cain did not.
Mm-hmm.
We see that he did not obey.
Now,
But he sacrificed. He didn't obey.
and that leads very nicely, Richard, to kind of summarize what Richard was saying, that obedience is what matters to God. It's not just the worship isn't there for the sake of worship. These instructions are given to test obedience, to obey what is done, just as Abel obeyed by giving the first fruits of what he had. And that sets another important point when we're talking about the lessons from Leviticus chapter 10, is really what God is after when he gives these ultra-specific instructions. It's not for the arbitrary sake of, do it exactly as I say because, I'm God and you will listen to every word I say. It's because there's a measure of obedience. I remember from a movie talking about basketball and sports that I rewatched recently. And the line, this basketball coach is talking to a principal and to a student body, and he says, if these kids can't obey the simple rules of a basketball contract, how are they then going to go out and be expected to obey the laws in our country? If we can't simply obey when God says, make fire this way, or Noah, go build an ark out of gopher wood, then how can we expect to obey all of the other various sundry laws that God has if we can't obey the simple ones? It is about the obedience and the willingness to submit ourselves to rules that are not our own, but the willingness to submit ourselves to God and to obey his law over what we might think is best. And we're not even going to get into the fact that God knows better and he's going to give us a best way to do something. Not even getting into that tonight. Ian and then Carrie.
Human beings feel that ignoring the way they matters in the law, which is justice, faithfulness, and mercy. It's this idea of when you come to worship God, or rather when you praise Him. When you perform worship, who is it for?
Yes.
And far too often, many people perform the worship for themselves.
Right.
And that can even look appropriate from the outside looking at them.
Yeah.
Like, they're doing it the right way, but who is it for? Again, Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees was, you're doing this for yourself.
Yeah.
Let's just ignore the people who are just way off base and like, there is no prescription for this type of worship. Fine. That's obviously not authorized. Yet, there's a trap there where the people who are, I'm going to do this the right way, but who is it for? It makes themselves feel better, or maybe it's just something they do, or it's something that kind of soothes themselves as like, yeah, I did this thing, so now I'm good.
And that's why when Jesus summarizes the principles of worship, as we're going to talk about here very soon in John chapter 4, there's two parts of it. One part of it's truth, and the other part of it leans more into what Ian was saying about who are we doing it for. What is our attitude in going into worship? But that's getting a little bit ahead of where we are, but Ian makes a very, very apt point there, is that there is two sides to this equation where we can go too far into extremes. And we're just talking about these principles one by one, but once we get all of them there, there will be a Goldilocks zone that God establishes for us when it comes to worship. We can get too off kilter one way or the other. Carrie?
Quick repeat of what you said. The worship that honors God is the worship that's done by His instruction.
Right.
If we are innovative on our worship, the sincerity does not make it right. If we honor God according to our creation, then our worship now honors ourselves, and that's what we keep on.
Yeah. And that's why it's important to establish that these are the principles with which we should establish and filter through all of what we do. Is that principle of doing it as God says, deviating as little as we possibly can or not at all, is so important, and why the stakes are so high. So Any last comments or questions on Leviticus 10 and that second principle before we move forward? And also, if I don't see your hand, feel free to say my name and get my Luffy.
Some people call worship Sabbath.
Okay.
And I get a little confused about that. Why would they call it Sabbath, but it's the first day of the, I don't know.
Well, so the idea, why? Yeah. So what Lupi was asking is that some people call worship Sabbath and refer to our worship on the first day of the week as Sabbath worship. From what I understand, the people that do refer to it as that are not looking at it so much as the day of the week, but rather it is a day with which we rest from our jobs and we go to worship God. Now, I bristle at calling our Sunday worship Sabbath because, one, it's not the last day of the week, it's the first day of the week. And number two is that it is different than the Jewish Sabbath in that there was a lot of laws that were instituted and a lot of traditions that grew around the Sabbath day for Judaism and that were also commanded that we don't hold at all even on the first day of the week. So I bristle at that, but why some people will use that is they look at it as, well, we're resting to come worship God. I still don't necessarily like that equation, that equating those two things, but that's as far as what I've read and what I've heard people use when they refer to Sunday as the Sabbath. That's how they mean it. Saturday would be the Sabbath for anyone that still holds and practices Judaism and in the Old Testament. Any other comments or questions before we move forward? Okay, so I want us to move into now over to the book of Malachi. Some of you have probably heard me bring this up before. But Malachi is one of the minor prophets. It's the last book before Matthew in most of our Bibles. And it is one of, like a lot of the minor prophets, I think sometimes we are not as knowledgeable on these books as some of the other books of the Bible. And eventually, I'm sure maybe me, will be doing a minor prophets class at some point in the future. Someone will. But Malachi chapter 1, to me, gives one of the best Old Testament depictions of the other side of worship. We've been talking a lot about accuracy, doing it according to God's standard. What we see in Malachi is a problem that God has with the worship that the Levite priests are allowing, and this is after captivity. This doesn't have anything to do with idolatry or them holding the things that are not according to the law, but rather there's something else wrong with their worship. And that the argument God makes through Malachi is they say that they're doing what the law says, but in actuality they are not fulfilling the law. Let's see. Ian, could I get you to read for me, please, Malachi chapter 1 if you're there. And we'll go ahead and do verses 6 through... go ahead and do 6 through 13, 6 through 12, please.
A son naturally honors his father, and a slave respects his master. If I am your father, where is my honor? If I am your master, where is my respect? The Lord who rules over all asks you this. You priests who make light of my name, but you reply, how have we made light of your name? You are offering improper sacrifices on my altar. Yet you ask, how have we offended you? By treating the table of the Lord as if it was of no importance. For when you offer blind animals as a sacrifice, is that not wrong?
Also 13, please.
You also say how tiresome it is. You turn up your nose at it, says the Lord who rules over all, and instead bring what is stolen, lame or sick. You bring these things for an offering? Should I accept this from you? Asked the Lord.
Thank you. So what is the problem that God is having with the people of Israel and with the priests, according to this passage? Say that again, Carla. They're offering unacceptable sacrifices. Exactly, Blake. Exactly. As Richard pointed out for us, there's this idea that is given the Mosaic Law. You give the first fruits of what you have. God is very specific about the types of sacrifices, and if you were in the Hebrews class, Ian did a great job of going through the structure of the Levitical sacrifices and what, according to the law, was acceptable to be sacrificed. And there were a lot of provisions there. If you couldn't afford an oxen or a lamb, then you could offer a bird, and if you didn't have that, then you could offer flour. And I know I'm simplifying a lot of things, but there were different provisions that God made it to where anyone could offer a sacrifice along those guidelines that he established. And so what they're doing here in Malachi is, this isn't a problem with adultery, idolatry. It's not a problem with idolatry. It's not a problem of they're doing something inaccurate, but rather that they're not following through on the full spirit of the law, which is really the issue God has, is outlined in verse 13. You say, how tiresome it is, and you disdainfully sniff at it, or in Ian's translation it says, you turn up your nose at it. Same idea. You just kind of derisively sniffing, turning up your nose. This is too much work. They say that the people are treating God's sacrifice as something common or something that is a burden. Not as something to be joyful that they're having their sins turned over another year, that they're getting atonement, but rather, we got to go to Jerusalem again. We got to go get an ox and we got to go kill it. How tiresome. I'm tired of giving God, I really would like that fattened calf. So I'll give God the lame one. We'll give him Stumpy over there. He's got 3 legs. I'm giving an ox. I'm doing what God said. How could God not accept that? There's a heart problem. The problem that the people are having is it's not that they're not sacrificing. It's not that they're not checking the box of the law, but kind of what Ian was saying earlier, is there is something going on deeper within themselves where they have an issue in their heart. They aren't truly worshiping God in their heart and desiring to give back to God, to sacrifice God, to worship God with the fullness of themselves. They're saying, it's a burden. It's hard. It's tiring. It takes a lot of work. I got to go pick out the good one. Again, Stumpy's right over there. He's not hard to catch. He's got 3 legs. And so we'll take that. And the priests, the reason God is specifically upset at the priesthood, is they're accepting this. They're accepting this half-hearted worship of the people. In verse 8, God says that you wouldn't present this to your governor or to someone who had physical authority over you. And the implication there is because they would punish you for it. But you're going to give it to me, God? That shows the heart of a person, how much they really care about giving back to God, worshiping to God, because they would give their earthly governor better, but they just give the reserves of what they have to God. So this establishes our third principle, is that we must do it with our heart. We must give to God not as a burden, or worship God not as a burden. We must give fully of ourselves, desiring to do so. And then the fourth point is in the book of 2 Kings. And we're not going to go through this as extensively because it kind of falls in with the first two, but it's worth mentioning. Josiah, he's this king that was prophesied to arise in the kingdom of Judah. Really, really, really good king. Really young when he comes to power. Now, the king before him was really, really bad and was one of the worst kings ever in Judah. And in the time of those kings before Josiah, the book of the law was lost. Don't ask me how that happened. Don't ask me how they lost the Mosaic law in the temple, but it was lost. And then under Josiah, they clean out the temple and they try to restore it. And in the midst of it, the high priest finds the book of the law. And Josiah commands that it be read to the people. And after it is read to the people, he says, we must worship God as it is written. Here in chapter 20, I said 23. It is in 23, where he makes this covenant between himself and the people. When we are talking about these principles, this is our last one. Do it as it is written. So if we were to look at these in chronological order, first, God has a standard. Second is that we do not improvise from that standard. Third is that we do it as it is written, as it comes from God. And the last is that we must do it with our heart. Now, these are all Old Testament passages. Now, let's see if that contradicts something that Jesus says about worship. And I sort of referenced this earlier. Let's turn over to John chapter 4. Very, very quick context. John chapter 4. Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman at the well. She comes to Jesus, who is a Jew, is amazed that he even speaks to her. He asks her for water. She's amazed by this. The Samaritan woman then asks, or Jesus says a point about living water. She inquires about that. Jesus essentially begins to preach to her. And he makes an extremely important point that is the guiding point for all of worship. And Jesus really sums it down for us. And this is a guiding principle that we see in the New Testament concerning worship. Blake, could you read for me John chapter 4 and starting in verse 21 through 24, please.
Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshiper will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him in spirit and in truth."
Okay. Actually, through 24. I'm sorry, Blake, I cut you off.
That was 24.
Oh, yes. No, you're good. So, what does Jesus say very plainly about worship? Worship is what? Spirit and what? Truth. So, if we look at the four things we listed off that we saw about worship in the Old Testament, God has a standard. Do not improvise from that standard. Do not deviate. Worship him as it is written. Do it as it is written. That all speaks to what? Truth. It all speaks to truth. Now, the last point we looked at, or the point we looked at in Malachi chapter 1, is that concerning more spirit or more truth? If we're to worship, as we said, the principle there that we truly worship God in our heart, that it's not just about checking a box. Does that apply more to worshiping God in spirit or worshiping God in truth? Yes. Okay, you're not wrong. But I think that leads a little more into the side of spirit. Is all four of those principles that we looked at are echoed and solidified and repeated by Jesus. We worship God. Those who are going to worship God will do so according to those things, spirit and truth. Now, we're going to talk a lot about truth when we talk about the 5 aspects of worship. Truth being as it is written, as is commanded, as the examples that we see. But what I don't want us to lose sight of is that there is a heart or a spirit aspect to this. Very quickly, when spirit is a hard word sometimes for us in the English language. See, I can't even say the word English. Spirit is somewhat nebulous, ephemeral. There are several words in the Greek that actually that come down to the word spirit or pneuma. There's a lot of different ways that that word is used. And it's same sometimes when we talk about in English. What the type of spirit, worshiping God in spirit and truth, comes down to sort of this Jewish understanding of the self. The self is made up of 3 component parts. You have your body, you have your mind, and you have your soul or your spirit. And yes, I know soul and spirit, there's technically a difference, but it's very thin line, like very, very thin. But the soul and the spirit is the inner man, right? It's what we truly feel. It's what I don't want to say feel, but what we truly believe and truly dedicate to with our heart. It's putting our whole inner man into something. Let's think of it this way. Have you ever seen, in whatever field of expertise you might be in, the difference between someone who's just sort of trying to get through the day, they produce something that they're just trying to get to the end of the day, versus someone who is truly committed, truly into the work that they're doing, versus someone who's just trying to get a paycheck? Can you see the difference in those types of work? That's the person who is just trying to get a paycheck, they're just trying to get through and do the bare minimum. And in most circumstances, that quality will be lesser, or it'll be discernible from the person that puts all of themselves into something, that truly puts their whole effort, their whole self into something. Not in every case, but in the vast majority of cases. You can especially see that with art. The point of going through that whole diatribe is when we talk about worshiping God in spirit and truth, we can sort of think of it as doing something with our whole heart or our whole self. Jesus even talks about this in the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 3, he talks about the church in Laodicea. And in Laodicea, they're near a place, sort of this hot spring where their water, I'm not going to go into the whole history, this is very oversimplified. But essentially they had a problem or something that happened in that city where they would often have lukewarm water. It would have a mixture of hot and cold water. And Jesus says that you are neither hot nor cold, in talking about the church in Laodicea, and says that because you are neither hot nor cold and you are lukewarm, I will spew you or vomit you out of my mouth. The point Jesus is saying there in Revelation chapter 3 is that if a church is going to follow Christ and by extension worship Him, either you're all in, you're hot, or you're all out. Sitting the fence, being halfway in, 75% of the way in, will not be acceptable to Christ. That worship is not acceptable to Him because it's not with the whole heart. It is not worshiping God in spirit and in truth. We all more or less on the same page there. If I need to slow down, tell me. But do we understand the spirit aspect and the truth aspect? Carol.
I think the point Jesus is also making here to the woman is that under the old law, their worship was very physical. They all of the articles of the tabernacle, all of the animal sacrifices, the sprinkling of the blood, all of it was a physical thing they could actually see. Whereas in the new law, we worship spiritually. We worship the God we do not see. We worship with the heart. We worship with the mind. And that's what he's trying to focus on. We don't. It's not the mountain or it's not Jerusalem anymore. It's
that is a great, great point. Is, as Carol was just saying, to sum that up, if you couldn't hear that, is that Jesus is making the point that the old worship in the old law mattered what mountain you were at. It mattered where the temple was, where the tabernacle was. It was very physical. And in the new law, Jesus is establishing that this is much more spiritual. It's something that we do not do in the sort of corporeal or physical sense. In the old law, a lot of the things they could do as far as their worship, the results of it, they could see, feel, hear, smell, and touch, versus in the new law, we don't sacrifice an animal. We are giving of ourselves. We're giving of that inner part of ourselves. That is how we worship God, is in the spiritual sense. And that's very important to keep in mind. Now, I, of course, with my great foresight and planning, have used up almost all of our time. So, I want us to set the stage for what we're going to talk about next week in talking about preaching and then giving, Lord willing. I want us to end with this question. So, we have our 5 acts of worship: preaching, prayer, Lord's Supper, giving, and singing. Not in that order, by the way. There's no order preference. That's just the way my mind rattled it off. So, we're going to start with talking about preaching. And I want us to first start with this question. Is how do we know that preaching is supposed to be a part of the worship service? Now that might seem like an odd or silly question, but if you stop to think, we always say it's part of the 5 acts of worship. But how do we know that in the first century church, or when the church was established, that the act of preaching, someone going up and giving a lesson, speaking the words of God from their mouth, because that's what preaching is, how do we know that that was done? Richard? Turn over to Acts chapter 20 very quickly, because that's what Richard is referring to. Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, of course, is where we see the idea that we meet on the first day of the week. But shortly after that, the story continues. Acts chapter 20, Richard, since you brought it up, could you read for me verses 8 through 11, please, of Acts 20?
There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered together. There was a certain young man named Eutychus, sitting on the window sill, sinking into a deep sleep. And as Paul kept on talking, he was overcome by sleep and fell down from the 3rd floor and picked up dead. But Paul went down and fell upon him, and after embracing him, he said, "Do not be troubled, for his life is in him." And when he had gone back up and had broken the bread and eaten, he talked with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. They took him away, the boy alive, with great comfort.
All right, thank you. So, and this is also in verse 7, but what was Paul doing? He was preaching. He was talking to them. They're there to worship God. It says they're talking to them. He's preaching. He's giving them a lesson. And he's giving them one that goes on for such a long time, someone falls asleep and falls out a window. I can promise you that that most likely will not happen when I'm preaching, especially here, because if you fall out that window, it's not a very long way down. Though you might hit your head. That's a joke. But the point of the matter is that we see a direct example. Paul is preaching. He is there. He's talking. And as we established last week, Paul repeats this many times in the epistles. He says, I give you instruction, a pattern, just as I give to every church. So if Paul is doing it in one church, in Troas, what can we then necessarily infer? That he's doing it everywhere. He's setting the principle. This is what you do when you come together to break bread. You partake of the Lord's Supper, and then you have someone talk. And we see this, and we'll talk a couple of other passages next week. But I want you to see too, and go and scour the New Testament for any time preaching is mentioned, and since you have the questions that we'll talk about next week, if you want to do some homework, not required by the way, we're not going to have a test, but if you want to do some preparation for next week, answer those questions, look at some of those verses, and also see if you can find any other verses either in the Old or New Testament, but especially in the New Testament, that talk about preaching. I appreciate everyone's comments and questions, and I do apologize that we took a little bit long to get through the sort of authority and the principles for authority of worship, but those are the foundations. If we're going to talk about the 5 acts of worship, I think it's very important that we establish scripturally what worship is, why it is, and why it is important, gravely so, that we adhere to the pattern or the standard, we do it as written, we do it with all of our heart, and we do it as close to as God commands as possible. So I appreciate your patience, and I very much appreciate all the comments of those that spoke tonight. And with that being said, Larry and Rikus, would you mind leading us in a closing word of prayer?
Let's pray. Father in heaven, we were absolutely thrilled to be here, studying your word, and find the things that you would have us do. We pray that we'll be conscientious of the things that are in the works that you provided, that we don't stray from them, we don't adapt, we don't change, that we follow to the best of our ability your instruction. We ask that as we study these examples and the patterns that are set before us, that we maintain the consistency to serve you and to be in a place in our hearts that we are totally dedicated and completely committed to worshiping and honoring you in all that we do. Be with us as we depart. Help us to always remember our family and our friends as they continue to struggle throughout the week. Be with us until we meet again on Sunday. This is our prayer in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.